Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Equianopod. We haven't done one of these in quite a while, but I'm really delighted to actually be joined by a young, emerging thinker and writer on a topic that I just think we cannot avoid, we cannot downplay, and I think that this particular gentleman, I think, actually just perfectly encapsulates a lot of what we're trying to do at the Equiano Project, which is take on complex and polarizing and deeply difficult moral questions in a way that cannot always be neatly placed into one uh, hard and fast partisan camp. This doesn't mean that we don't take sides, we do. And I think actually it's really important to sometimes take sides because equivocation and fence sitting doesn't necessarily get us closer to the answer, but that doesn't mean that we erase the complexity and deep challenges on the sides that we take. So I am really excited to be joined by Harry Saul Markham. He is a author, as I mentioned, and he is publishing, and I think by the time this comes out, it will be published, a new book called The Melted Pot: Diversity, Antisemitism, and the Limits of Tolerance. And you can, hear already from the title and subtitle some of the themes that we'll be exploring on this short-ish discussion. So thank you so much for joining me, Harry.
Thank you. And by the way, it's Markham.
Do you know,
No,
just before this, I actually asked him how to pronounce it, and then I've messed it up.
no,
And
no,
this
no, no, it's fine. People call I once did an interview with Talk TV and they called me Mark Saul Markham. So this is a step
so
up, I think.
firstly, just tell us an abridged version of what this book's about, and then it'll be really interesting to just hear like why you wanted to write it and why you felt that you were particularly compelled to write this book.
Sure, thank you. Firstly, thank you for having me here. It's great to be here with you and your lovely audience. So I decided to write this after I experienced on the streets of London in the May of 2021 a horrendous anti-Semitic ordeal outside um, Downing Street, in which a very large group, mostly men, mostly Muslim, I should say, um, accompanied by their children, many of them were accompanied by their children, um, targeted us, a small group of pro-Israel protesters, in the most, I would say, terrifying, in the most terrifying way. We were targeted with extreme almost murderous abuse. A very large rock was hurled towards us, along with other missiles and so on. It was a horrendous experience, and it led me to question really how could it be on the streets of a city so widely celebrated for its tolerance and diversity, a group of Jews could feel so targeted in this way. Um, and I suppose my book really came from that particular incident, and I've really tried to have a reckoning with what it means to live in a diverse society, what it means to live in a multicultural, um, modern, inclusive society, have and to wrestle with the pressing questions of living in that society, such as what are the limits of our magnanimity? Are there any limits to that? Um, what kind of things have gone fundamentally wrong with the way in which we have done multiculturalism, and what are the philosophical, political, and social delusions which have really gone with this idea of trying to cultivate a society or engineer a society in which there are no or nothing really which binds different people together. So the book wrestles with those pressing questions, but does so in an accessible, and I would also say, and we'll return to this in a moment, in very much a radically centrist way.
Okay, so interesting. I mean, obviously, really horrible and very sad to hear about the experience that you had. And I guess what the question that came to mind is that were you unfamiliar with these arguments kind of beforehand? Because obviously obviously a huge experience like that will shock someone and shape them and make them question. But obviously the criticisms of multiculturalism and the argument that it really covers for deep divisions within society and reinforces them has been around for perhaps 20 years. And so how did you feel about those arguments before, or did it change your mind, or were you much more of a supporter of multicultural policy and this changed your mind, or were you already, aware of some of these criticisms?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I was aware. Look, at the time I was 21, I'm 25 now. I went to a school in northeast London, an Orthodox Jewish school in which the majority of the pupils there were Muslim, Christian, Hindu. It was a very strange place. Brilliant, but it was peculiar because we had it was an Orthodox Jewish school in which students came from all different walks of life, and all male students had to wear a head covering and so on. So my experience of living in a multicultural environment up until that point were, look, yes, there were problems, but I had seen actually a multicultural. I went to a school and grew up in an area in which we got on pretty well. Um, but then after that experience, it really was for me if you will, a turning point in the way in which I saw diversity, and it occurred to me that what's happening now is that what happened then and what's happening now and happening for many years now is that there have been so many binaries in this debate about that. Look, diversity is great, diversity is our strength, and on the other hand, no, diversity is our weakness. That diversity has completely failed, and the middle ground doesn't seem to be relevant anymore. Doesn't seem fit for purpose for being able to interrogate its own shortcomings about, well, look, what's gone wrong here with diversity, but at the same time, what can we do to make diversity actually function and work? Because diversity, as I've argued, is actually a very good thing so long as we embrace that which can bring people together.
And so when you talk about this kind of centrist middle ground, what I think it'd be really interesting to elaborate on that, because I think that actually I would argue that a lot of the people that have, at least for me, influenced me trying to criticize multiculturalism over the last, several decades, many of them, if you think about someone, I don't know, like Kenan Malik or David Goodhart, or even Trevor Phillips, a lot of them have, you know, tried to argue this from perhaps a left perspective, or but it's been, I think, the that it's still been caricatured as a kind of right wing view. And so is it really useful then to think about it as kind of I'm trying to make a centrist argument? Because the way that the debate is framed is that anyone that criticizes these things is automatically just like framed in a particular way. And so why was it important for you to take that specific framing and make it a kind of framing of you're trying to come at this from a kind of centrist perspective?
Well, for one, I am part of a minority group. I'm British, but I'm also Jewish. So in that sense, I recognise that if it weren't for the right to be different, the right to be other, I wouldn't be here. So in that sense, there is a kind of personal responsibility I have towards the very notion of living in a diverse society. Secondly, across Western Europe and around the world, forces of populist right, the populist right are on the rise. Okay, and I don't see those movements as anti-democratic or extreme or any of the other epithets which have been, thrusted upon those groups wrongly, um, because those movements are representing the legitimate grievances held by many people. My view is that there needs to be a kind of populist centrism, a populist centrism which is able to really tackle the issues which drive people to your Marine Le Pen's, your Geert Wilders, and so on. And to that extent, we have to be willing to confront that which isn't particularly comfortable. We have to talk about things which are in this taboo zone. Um, that doesn't mean we do so by giving up on the principles which we value, because of course, to me, the hallmark of liberalism is the sanctity of otherness and the right to be different. I'm a student of John Stuart Mill, and I believe in the virtue of crowds. Some have rightly spoken about the madness of crowds, and you're right, some crowds are totally insane, particularly on campuses. But there is in the idea of having diverse opinion in intellectual pluralism, if you will, there is a particular virtue, and I think that that is not just a kind of coincidental factor, but I think that's a necessary element within the liberal democratic framework, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think again, many people listening will very much agree with you here, and I think that this is definitely a really difficult line to enter into, and we find that particularly now at the Equiano Project, how the debate has changed even in the last 5 years since we launched, and how many people that were originally, for example, critics of identity politics, and critics of the excesses of kind of progressive authoritarian censorship, but now we're seeing this kind of reactionary backlash on the right, and a reemergence of a white identity politics, and how we become that voice that both criticizes the excesses of the left, but the a kind of deeply kind of potentially ethno-nationalist exclusionary politics on the right. And it's very difficult because those people that are wanting to hold that liberal space often feels like it's becoming smaller and smaller, because of so many of the forces that are shaping our politics. But I guess so. Let's get into a few. I mean, I want people to read this book, and so I think that they should read it to really understand the all of the nuances and scope of your argument. But let's get into a few of these taboo areas. So what? Yeah, to make it more concrete, what taboos do you think that we are not confronting, and what do you think are the consequences of not confronting them?
Well, there are many taboos. We're in an age which is filled with many taboos to pick from. There's a taboo pick and mix, if you will. But I think that the perhaps the one I think needs really urgent discussion is my argument, and I suppose this is in a way which in a way which that makes my book unique in this particular area of study of political extremisms or religious extremism, is this idea of Islamism beyond Islamists. Um, Now, I'll say that, of course, as someone who used to work for the oldest British Muslim organisation in the country, and as someone who worked very closely with Muslim Voices Working for Change, this isn't to say, obviously, that this is the problem for all Muslims in Britain or around the world. On the contrary, there are many who are working for this wonderful change, this much needed reconciliation. And part of my book is not to become the ally of Islamists, but to become the ally of pluralists and those working for change, because I believe that it's incumbent upon liberals to actually embrace the pluralistic, open, free Islam that's being promoted by the likes of the Sheikh who wrote the foreword to my book and other Muslim voices, and not to become one of those that just write off all of Islam and therefore become as essentialist and as reductive as Islamists. But
Okay, but what
but
what's
but
the
but 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 the taboo
mm,
specifically is the normalization of Islamist thinking within swathes of these Muslim communities across Western Europe. So one example of this I'll give you is the back in 2021, the year in which we had that horrendous ordeal in London. A group of young Muslim men travelled from Blackburn to London, and they went through a Jewish area and they chanted "F the Jews, rape their daughters," and all these other horrendous things through Finchley, again, a Jewish area. And they now, what was interesting, aside from the fact that the case against these guys got dismissed, was that these guys are not Islamists. They're not wrapped up in the in the ideological writings of Islamist thinkers. They were very much ordinary Muslim men who went out to intimidate Jews. Now, what could possibly have led ordinary Muslim men to go and do that? And in fact, I'll say many of the people, our near lynching incident on May of 2021, again, ordinary people. So the Islamism beyond Islamist idea is the entrenched ideas within these communities of anti-Jewish thinking. And that's often associated with anti-democratic thinking, sexism, homophobia, and so on. And it's that which provides the fertile ground for the actions of a violent few. Part of the taboo here is to think that Islamism and is as fringe and marginal as white supremacy, right? They treat both ideas as kind of fringe, irrelevant um, ideologies which exist in certain communities. Well, yes, it's true that it's only a few within those communities that will go out and commit acts of violence, but the ideological breeding ground for violent extremism is in no way comparable, because in what I've produced in my book is a study of how these ideas have become so normalized and mainstream. And Mehdi Hassan, um, in his book, called it, I think, in an article he wrote, he's no Israel loving, Jew loving individual, but he described
It's a dirty little secret, yeah.
yeah, exactly, right. And it's kind of that which I'm concentrating on as the kind of ideological breeding ground which lays the fertile ground for violent extremism.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is, for example, when we think about the Salman Rushdie affair, this was decades ago, and thousands and thousands and thousands of British Muslims went out in support not of Salman Rushdie, but in favor of his harassment, his uh, threat, his the fatwa. Um, and so I think that when it comes to this idea again of trying to hold the liberal position, I guess my provocation to you, and I think some people might be thinking this, is that the truth is that the evidence that the jig is out. It is extremely difficult. I won't say impossible. I'm not someone that thinks this type of thing is impossible, but it is extremely difficult to counter the fundamentally prevailing forces within huge sections of the Muslim community, which are deeply illiberal, deeply hostile to very basic liberal values like freedom of speech, or equality for women and other things like that. And there's a whole host of reasons for them. But I guess a lot of people have been trying to say this for a very long time, and it's been very difficult. But we've known in various ways for decades, and therefore, why still hold on to this idea that just through kind of awareness and discussion and debate and championing liberal voices that this will change? Because it hasn't so far. What makes you think that amplifying certain organizations or certain individuals or certain ideas will change, when the truth is that the zeitgeist and the all the energy and all of the sway is fundamentally held by these very illiberal forces?
Because we have to find a way of making this country, this society, this civilization cohesive, and we have to make sure it functions properly. And to that extent, I would say, yes, we need carrots. Yes, we need to amplify the voices of those who are working for change. Yes, we need to um, support. We need to provide better support in terms of more adequate integration policies and so on, and the rest of it. At the same time, you're right. We need some sticks. Metaphoric, of course. We need to be able to have, and this is part of what I say is ultimately is part of the liberal delusion, is that over the years we haven't successfully identified who we really are. And because we haven't identified who we really are, we haven't been able to establish what are our boundaries. And if we don't have boundaries, how can we possibly assert anything, right? And that to me has been the crux of this problem. This problem isn't really political. It is in a sense that policies may assuage some of the most pressing issues that we're facing. I mean, we can talk about better managing the borders and stopping small boats and better integration policies and all the rest of it. But in order to deal with the essence of this problem, we need cultural reckoning, cultural reevaluation. And we have to be able to think about the fundamental essence of what it means to be British today. And for that reason, if so long as we don't do that, we cannot possibly push back against these forces,
But
much less bring them
yeah,
into a cohesive national identity.
well, this is again where the right-wing argument comes in, where they say that, well, this is the problem, that we never had to constantly reassess what it meant to be British, that when you kind of have these communities, that by definition, because these groups are different and are challenging our values and challenging our norms, then you have to start to think about what it means to be British. And actually, that is the problem. That actually, before it was implicit, before it was very much known, and not only that, when you get to a certain level of kind of numbers and confidence, well, people have as much right to define what it means to be British as you and I. For example, if we take the Gaza independence, well, they were democratically elected. They, you know, got votes in their community, and there is no reason to assume that this trend will not continue in some form. So they're British. How why should our version of Britishness trump theirs if they believe and they're getting votes on values of blasphemy laws or deeply anti-Israel sentiments? How does then that does become a kind of clash of civilizations? That's the kind of right wing argument there. So how do you respond to that?
Well, because the notion of Britishness has become so wishy-washy to the point it doesn't really mean anything. Um, that's part of the problem. Well, actually, that is the problem. Um, that that British and the people on the right are dead right to say this, that British identity has become so diluted, and there is a reason for that. Really, it's because since 1945 and gradually through various developments in intellectual thought, that the nation has become associated with all the terrible things which occurred in the past, the Holocaust, totalitarianism, Nazism, etc. So any notion of national identity has to be inclusive, right? In order to not be anything concrete or anything which runs the risk of becoming exclusionary, right? I think in the book I call it passport nationalism. It just means to own a passport and to be a bit kind and nice. Now, that's all well and good. But national identity does have to include, and part of the value system has to now reconsider this think beyond the nation state mentality. And I think that that is a growing force around the world. The repudiation of globalism, the sense that globalism is no longer fit for purpose, this sense that um, uh, uh, that being part of huge multinational organizations isn't actually democratic and is harming people, particularly working class people in local communities. People want to see a resuscitation of a concrete national identity. Um, and so the people on the right who make this claim that actually, yeah, the Gaza vote or whatever are just as British, well, what is it even? Why should we have to keep changing our national identity to keep people on board? Well, they're right. We shouldn't. But that's part of the failure of successive liberal governments, not left-wing governments, liberal governments, because it's liberalism which has really taken the lead in this anti-national globalist movement here. Liberal governments to be able to integrate people and defend and assert the values of people when they come into the country. And is it too late? Is it too late? It could well be too late, but we have to act as if it isn't too late, because the alternative is what? We persist in this situation
Well,
and we allow
the
forces which,
alternative for some is it is quite worrying, as I said in the beginning, because I think that there is a lot of despondency and a lot of despair, and I do think that the alternative for some is actually taking extremely illiberal measures in order to, almost try and reverse some things, demographic change. And I think that is what I think liberals really need to grapple with. I think that they've kind of just assumed that people will just be docile indefinitely. But I do think that because there is so much kind of cultural and national alienation, that actually can breed forces that are really hostile to absolutely everything that we're
yeah,
talking that we value. And so I think that responsibility of liberal minded folks to recognize that we are in the danger zone and that everything that we value could potentially be disintegrated within a generation unless we do something. And so, on that point, I think just finally is that what are those boundaries then that we need to then assert? What are the what should be our red lines in terms of what it means to be British, what it means to be liberal, and what it means to live together going forward? Because I think on that point there is that tension. Take the issue of um, Batley Grammar School, where the teacher was forced into hiding for showing images of the Prophet Muhammad that offended some Muslims, and they, intimidated him and so on and so forth. There are some liberals who believe that not doing those things, not showing images that are deemed offensive by some groups, is the liberal compromise. That's what they think. They think that in order
mm,
to protect the sensibilities of minorities, that the compromise is actually for us to be less supportive of free speech and for us to respect that they perceive respecting difference in that way. Whereas for me, I would say the opposite is the one cannot protect minorities unless freedom of speeches exists because it protects minority views. But where would
okay.
you say those lines should be then?
Well, it's fundamentally an assertion that we are a culturally Christian but ultimately secular liberal democratic country. And frankly, I think we need some more spunk, we need some more courage in being able to tell people who are here that if you don't like it this way, then you don't need to stay. And I liberals have become uh, so cautious and tentative to the point of becoming irrelevant, right? They've become totally unremarkable. I mean, look at Starmer. Starmer is just so unremarkable, and his opposite, I wouldn't say Kemi, but Farage is offering something which is a lot more interesting, right? And that's his success is the centre ground's failure. And I want to see a centre ground be able to say to people who are in this country, we have our way of life here. You speak English, you embrace the country you're in. You retain who you are. You can have this hyphen. I'm a British Jew, so I love my country to bits. My grandparents served in the army here. My two grandfathers did during the war. I feel very much a part of its history, culture, and identity. And yet I also am a practicing Jew, right? And uh, people of different faiths should should have that right too, to be a part of the national culture, to accept it, but also to be able to retain their own identities. What worries me is that I see that the British and French models of how we do, because the French, by the way, reject the very idea they have multiculturalism. I worry that the French have become far too hostile towards any notion of embracing individual identities, and we in the and conversely us in the UK have become far too hostile to anyone who wants to embrace a British identity. And I propose a kind of Goldilocks middle ground method, which is that we get a lot tougher. And Ayan Hirsi Ali, in her wonderful book Pray, and in my book, and others have highlighted how we get tougher by integrating through certain policies, through certain cultural and intellectual changes which will happen over time. And at the same time, we respect the right of people to be different. And difference and part of my part of my worry is that I don't want people to think that in order to have a tough, robust, strong integration policy, you are in any way opposed to cultural diversity. I'm not. I want to see a multicultural society function. I don't want multiculturalism, because the ideas which underpin it are, in their essence, delusional. And therein lies the problem. And that's why I want to be able to see a liberal state take a much more, David Cameron said muscular liberalism, fine, if that's the term we want to use, but I want to see the liberal state be a lot more assertive, a lot more tenacious in asserting the boundaries which underpin Western democratic civilization.
Thank you so much, Harry. I think that that is a great introduction to your book, and there's so many
Thank you.
things I could ask, and I really just think that people need to read your book to kind of dive deeper into the specificities of what you're talking about, but also
Thank you.
to get much more insight. And I think there's a lot that you said that I agree with, and I this is I think one of the most important subjects of our time. I think that the things that we all value and the values that underpin this organization is really under threat. And I think that we are already entering, but it could get a lot worse. We can't think that it can't get worse. And we stand hugely in solidarity with the British Jewish community, the global Jewish community, and against anti-Semitism. And we stand completely unafraid to call out racism and anti-Semitism wherever it comes from, whether that's from sections of the Muslim community to the far right, to left-wing identitarian politics. We oppose racism wherever it comes from. So thank you for writing this book. Thank you for speaking to us, and we really hope that we can have you again in another format, whether that's something, an event or a discussion with somebody else, because I think that we need to continue to tease out and find solutions to the challenges you're raising. So thank you.
Thank you.